all of a sudden, going back to 800 companies around the Prince George area, now there probably are 3 or 4. Some of them are medium-sized operators. The big ones, Canfor, Best Fraser, and others of the bigger ones have decided to substantially leave BC and invest elsewhere. My name is John Brink, and I'm the CEO of the Brink Group of Companies. And today I'm doing a solo podcast, in particular dealing with the forest industry and all the challenges that we have. But this podcast is focusing on softwood lumber duties, tariffs, and starting with the past, taking us through the history to today and where it may go from here on forward. And obviously we already know that recently the president-elect in the United States is Donald Trump, who has already indicated that he will aggressively pursue duties and tariffs on any imports into the United States, and I'm sure that will include a number of products from Canada, but in talking about lumber in particular, it likely will include lumber as well. So that then being said, I just want to kind of touch on where are we in the industry today as a whole. The industry, primary, secondary manufacturing, pellets, pulp, paper, all logging, all of those industries from coast to coast, from north to south in the province of British Columbia are connected. That we cannot have pulp operations or pellet operations or value-added manufacturers unless we have a viable primary sector, meaning where we cut timber and the residuals of that or part of the products they produce will go up the value chain. And that's the way it virtually always has been, but started in particular in 1965 in northern British Columbia when the changes were made to forest policy where as much as 50%, 60%, 70% in some cases of the tree would go up the burner into the burners. That attracted investments in pulp and paper manufacturing, and so from that point forward, mid-60s forward, the industry started growing and expanding. Before that period, and looking in the Prince George region in particular, but it's similar in different ways down the coast and on the island, but talking about northern British Columbia, there used to be around the Prince George area up to 800, yes, you heard me right, sawmills. The sawmills used to be small. They used to produce rough lumber mainly, and then they would take it into town. So they would get a patch of timber allocated. They would put the sawmill in the bush, then manufacture rough lumber that would be taken into town, and in this case, Prince George, and it then would go to River Road, then called, River Road is where we are located with our operations, downtown Prince George, close to the railroad and the river. It used to be called Plainer Road, where they would dry the lumber. Either they stack it, let it dry, and then they planed it, put it directly into carloads, ship it primarily to the United States. That's the way it used to be. Then, through government legislation, close utilization was demanded, and that you could no longer cut crown timber unless you were recovering residuals, in particular chips, so debarking and chipping became mandatory as a concession to the pulp and paper mill investors. And so a lot of the smallest companies consolidated, and that started already in the mid-60s. and the number of sawmills were reduced sizably. I estimated around the Prince George area, probably 60s, 70s, there may have been up to 20 or 25 sawmills in the region. So when I came into Prince George in 1965, I stood back in amazement how much of this beautiful timber was going up the burnup initially, and then how much of this beautiful timber would go into chips, and how little recovery we did in terms of value or extracting value. So starting from the bottom up, working in sawmills in a different locations, I always looked at the opportunity of building my own mill. And I started my first operation, a value-added manufacturing operation, as to where I saw an opportunity. And the opportunity was an experience that I already had in Europe and in Sweden, looking at what they were doing and which direction they were going, is that sizable portions of what I thought the lumber being manufactured in a sawmill could go up the value chain. And I still believe that today. So today I say that the value of the sawmills that we have today are a model that does not work going into the future for a number of reasons. And the one is obviously forest policy, that we have become from being a low-cost producer of fiber and lumber products to becoming a high-cost producer for a number of reasons. Part of that is policy, bureaucracy. The other one is UNDRIP, the designation of the land base to First Nations, and challenges in accessing fiber. Those are the challenges today, and hence, that being said, add to that other issues that may be not as well understood as the ones that we have today, but has happened that we used to have up to 120 sawmills in the province of British Columbia in 2000. Today we got probably less than 60, and still becoming smaller. Our annual allowable cut used to be around 60 million cubic meters annually. That was expanded as high as 90 million cubic meters annually during the pine beetle epidemic. And then now the volume is probably closer to 50 million cubic meters annually, but because of a number of factors that I just named, forest policy, environmental issues, UNDRIP, meaning the designation of the land base, the First Nations has to give consent to any harvesting that is being done in areas that are their traditional territories, and I support First Nations, obviously, but it has gone to the extent where planning for direction of planning for major investments in primary manufacturing that cost hundreds of millions, you have to have reasonable expectation or certainty to have access to fiber. That has become a real difficult situation. And so where the fiber availability, although the annual allowable cut is likely in the area of 50 million cubic meters annually, the accessible volume is probably closer to 25 to 27 million cubic meters. Hence, that being said, the other element, very, very important, I believe, is that softwood lumber duties, and although I have had opportunities to address that to a certain extent, others have, but I thought I want to do this particular segment of my podcast, taking it back in the past, why, when, how, and what does it mean, so that there is a better understanding, and how does it affect not only the primary sector or the major operators, the mid-size operators, the smaller operations, the value-added manufacturer, or that if there is an allegation, which there is by U.S. producers of lumber, that the industry in British Columbia in particular, but also in the rest of Canada, is likely subsidized in terms of having low-cost timber that they consider to be subsidized. And then it applies to those that have timber, in particular tenure, but there are also ones that have very little tenure, or those that have no tenure at all. And then we have the value-added sector, which is basically companies that rely, in a lot of cases, on primary manufacturers to buy lumber from them that they then further manufacture that goes up the value chain. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to say we have to do more of that. And a lot of times people are talking about that. Government is talking about that. Different governments. The BC Liberals, the NDP, everybody's talking about it. But they don't do anything about it. In fact, they do the opposite about it. Not by necessarily intent, but that has been the results. So what has happened as a result of all those things in combination, that industry, the big manufacturers that all of a sudden, going back to 800 companies around the Prince George area, now there probably are 3 or 4. Some of them are medium-sized operators. The big ones, Canfor, West Fraser, and others of the bigger ones have decided to substantially leave BC and invest elsewhere. And that could be in the U.S. Southeast or Sweden or other areas of investment. Why? Because public companies that have a board of directors that is accountable to their shareholders must find ways that they cannot operate continuously at losses, or as they look forward, there is no reasonable expectation of success or profitability. And obviously we don't see that right now in BC. And hence, companies like Canfor is a good example, but so is West Fraser and others, but Canfor in particular has decided to leave BC. And that means most of their sawmills they already have closed, and so have other companies. And so what we now see in BC, that we have sawmills being shut down from Fort Nelson to now, what soon will happen, Fort St. John, Chetwynd, Mackenzie, Bear Lake, Vanderhoof, Fraser Lake, Houston, Valemount, and other areas going through the process. And I believe that there will be further closures of pulp capacity, because for every 5 sawmills that go down, 4 or 5, there is too much that a sawmill or a pulp plant operation will go down because there is still too much pulp manufacturing capacity, and the fiber or the economic viable fiber they require is chips, not whole logs. So I think we will see further curtailment on the pulp side, and potentially and likely also on the primary side, this time more on the medium-sized companies on the primary sector. So that then being said, what happened to, now I've been in business here for nearly 50 years. In the next few months, it will be 50 years since I started Brink Forest Products in 1975. 3 employees, worked 7 days a week as long as I could stay physically awake, with a new concept and a new idea to add value to the lower. I had to find a fiber basket. All the timber was committed and taken, so I had to find a way of finding a niche. So the niche that I found is the lower quality, and again, looking at the sawmill, what qualities they produce. The grades, the lumber grades are economy, utility are number 3, and 2 and better. And then there are segments of there may be specialty grades within that. But what I focus on is on the low grades. Economy grade and a certain amount that didn't make the grade is called rejects. I saw that as an opportunity for my operation to cut the better pieces out of it, but in the process it would develop a lot of short pieces. So my experience being trained from the time I was 13 in the furniture factory, I have seen finger joint manufacturing. So I looked at that as an opportunity to take the smaller pieces, glue them together, and although everybody said, oh, they will never work in this, but I believed it did. And obviously 50 years later, I'm still in business. We're still very, very successful. And I still see that as the direction the industry in the future will have to go. Where we are now, don't want to scare anybody or be negative. I'm a positive individual. I believe in Canada. I believe in BC. I'm investing in BC. In the forest side, industry side, as everybody likely knows, I've been trying to buy 3 sawmills or 4 sawmills from Canfor. And so I still believe in the forest industry in BC, and obviously I'm also in warehousing as one of our silos. The other silo is real estate, both residential, commercial, and industrial. So I still believe in the future, but as far as the forest industry is concerned, it must take a different direction. In the direction that I see, that unfortunately over all the time, looking back, it has consolidated the industry to where less than a half a dozen mills control probably 80% of all the annual allowable cut in the province of British Columbia. That makes us too vulnerable, and I believe that we must change that. Where other things that have taken place is that especially in 2002, 2003, when the then BC Liberal government came in, made major changes that changed appurtency, meaning that the timber manufactured should be manufactured, or harvested should be manufactured in the region where it is harvested. And that was one. The other one was that we had, and this brings me to the softwood lumber duty thing, is that secondary manufacturing, I believed, very much had great potential. And I was able, together with some other people in the mid-90s, early 90s, and even already in the late 80s, to bring together the secondary manufacturing smaller companies in the province of British Columbia under an umbrella called the BC Lumber Value-Added Manufacturing Sector. 8 associations throughout the province, 800 companies. And we had convinced then the government of the day, the NDP government actually, of the day, that a timber allocation should be made to that sector up to 20% of the AAC that allowed them to create interaction between secondaries that have no tenure or timber with the primary sector. It was very successful, actually, and it stimulated and created many secondary manufacturing sectors that produced products, different products all throughout the marketplace and all around the world. Very potentially successful. In a region like Prince George, we used to have up to 40 secondary manufacturers. Today, we probably have less than 3. So what happened to secondary manufacturing? Now, the new model, the way I see as we go forward, as the industry is still getting smaller now, that the future of the industry has to be where we can be competitive in the global marketplace. The mills will become smaller. They will manufacture, of all the lumber they manufacture, that up to 50% of the volume they manufacture will go up the value chain, the top 25% and the lower 25% that we have focused on, still do today actually. What are the other challenges in our way other than the obvious ones that we already heard? There has always been challenges between the US and Canada for bringing timber or lumber into the United States. That goes back to the early 1900s for all intents and purposes. But for all that we can relate to now and where I was still involved or have been involved, it started on what they called Lumber 1 in 1982, where the U.S. manufacturers alleged that the industry in BC was subsidized, having low-cost timber, and subsequently were able to convince the legal system in the United States to apply duties on imports. So that went from 1982 to today, really, and it had different levels of duties. For the secondary sector was able to convince the negotiating teams in Canada, and BC then played a major role, being the larger producer of softwood lumber in Canada, that again we have to realize that the federal government negotiates with the U.S. federal government, obviously on duty rates, and then the provinces or the stakeholders then become part of the team, of the federal team, to negotiate equitable, hopefully, results. So we then, as this value-added sector in the province of British Columbia, were able to, because of being involved in the negotiations, of negotiate with the federal government to put a position forward that value-added manufacturers that have no subsidy, receive no timber or duties, and are producing below the cost of exporting volumes to the United States should pay really no duties, because it would, from our position, the federal government position, that we do not want to penalize further manufacturing, because obviously what we have to do, we have to add more social and economic value to our resources. That's a given. So that if we can make a case that value-added manufacturers should not pay a duty, then we have a perfect case to do that, because they are selling not below cost of manufacturing, and then the second, that they do not have the direct benefit of hands-out of subsidies, which was required. So the secondary manufacturing sector that fitted that category, which was most of them, were able to negotiate a deal, and I was directly involved in that, representing Alberta as well as BC, because we had operations in Alberta at that point, that we would pay duties only on the input volume, not on the export volume. Example, if something would cost, like on today's market where it is close to 15% duties, if we buy lumber at $100, and that would be the input volume value, we would pay $15. If we add $800 or say $900 and we sell it at $1,000, we would pay $150 or $1,500. So, the $150, that doesn't make sense. And so we were able to do that and defended that position through a number of different negotiations. Unfortunately, what happened is that only if the value-added sector was directly involved in the province, in particular the British Columbia, was representing this position to the federal negotiations team, then that was very, very important. Where all of this started going off the track was already in 2002, 2003. When a number of things happened, although the value-added sector was growing and expanding in British Columbia, where the then government of the day, the BC Liberals under Gordon Campbell, had decided to make major changes to forest policy. One of them was that there would be any timber that would be transferred between, meaning tenure, if it was transferred, 10 to 15% of that volume would go to the Crown to be designated to other uses, potentially. That was eliminated. Appurtency was eliminated in terms of manufacturing in the region where the timber is harvested and manufactured. That was eliminated. Then the third one that was eliminated, the small business program designated to stimulate value-added manufacturing that would have already been allocated 20% of the annual allowable cut to stimulate secondary manufacturers that they have something to trade with primaries, because what happens normally is that if you want to start a company and you need lumber as an input and you go to a primary to potentially get a deal or an agreement on a volume of timber, once you can satisfy that you can pay the bill and all the other kind of things, then, but the primary would say, what's in it for me? Well, nothing. So the whole concept behind it was that give them something that they have, something they can bring to the table and say, I have access to X amount of volume in timber, so in exchange for that, I need to have you make at least a reasonable expectation of access to your fiber. That part was eliminated, mostly eliminated. So what was left is about 2% of the total rather than 20%. That started the decline of the secondary sector throughout the province. The next thing that then happened as well is that gradually, in particular, as we take the clock forward to where we are now, is that although we were able to make a position as secondary manufacturers that first mill duties should be paid by those that do not get subsidy or have timber access, that part was really no longer considered. And then when the government took the position in 2016 in particular, with those negotiations, that position was not even advanced, and the negotiation team federally, and were quite involved with the feds, were the Council of Forest Industry in combination with BC Lumber Trade Council, which is for all intents and purposes one and the same, controlled by the 3 or 4 major companies within the province, did not even consider or bring up the issue of value-added manufacturers that should pay duty on the inputs, not on the export. That was another major deterrent to and supporting value-added manufacturers where, and give you an example of that Brink is a medium-sized company. We employ about 400 people when everything is right. We have value-added manufacturing plants in Prince George, Vanderhoof, and in Houston. And we, since 2017, have paid $70 million in duties. $70 million. In addition to that, we probably paid $10 million in bonds to support our ability to pay duties. That puts it at $80 million. And what did happen is that government, for all intents and purposes, did not even bother to raise the issue of value-added manufacturing and then make sure that they would not be thrown in or under the bus, and to protect the position that they have had, is that value-added manufacturers that do not have tenure, are not getting subsidized, would pay duty on first mill, meaning the input volume, not the export volume. How more ridiculous you want to get if you consider that the more value we can add here, the more people we employ, the more jobs we will be creating in the communities, on and on and on. It's virtually a no-brainer. In fact, we go even further in that. Then in 2005, in particular, because of these things driven by the major associations, including 𝗀𝗵𝘁 Lumber Trade Council, that are driven by a couple of companies that have no interest in value-added manufacturing. Although I was a member of them for virtually 40 years, trying to change direction, I finally gave up on it last April, and I resigned, although I was the vice chair of 𝗀𝗵𝘁, for differences of opinions. And this is one of the fundamentals, is that, so today, we don't have the value-added manufacturing sector anymore for all intents and purposes. And then we have a declining primary manufacturing sector. So where are the duties then today? Well, for us, the duties today are where we are paying, and so how they did that in 2017, that we have countervail duty, but then the other part they do in an analysis of anti-dumping is they take 4 companies, Canfor Corp, West Fraser Mills, and J.D. Irving and Tulco, and they evaluate them on anti-dumping. What does anti-dumping mean? AD, and the ones that we are looking at now is the current rate that is based on what they shipped in 2022. That's what has been analyzed. And on the basis of that, they have said that in their calculation that volumes are being sold in the marketplace below cost. That's not political. That is in accordance with their laws and rules, and obviously the value-added or the lumber manufacturing sector in the United States supports this. That as a result, it's just giving you an example that the anti-dumping rate alone for Canfor is 10.4, West Fraser about 5, and then J.D. Irving 7, and then same as Tulco 7 or 8. So for a total rate of Canfor, it's nearly 17, 12 for West Fraser, and then 11.6, and then 17.4. And then the rest of it, so based on those companies, 1, 2, 3, 4, they average that out in some formula that they say all the others, the countervail rate is only 6.7, which is still too much, but that adds another 7.8%, so the duty rate is 14.5% for all the others, meaning other primary manufacturers, but also secondary manufacturers that should not be paying this duty at all because they are not producing below cost. It's the majors that do that, not us or companies similar to us. And it's so bizarre that there is not much left. And so now that is based on 2022. Now already we know that they have already calculated 2023 of these companies that could likely will be the same, if not higher. This could go to, for all others, as high as 20% or 25%. And for companies like Canfor in West-Friesland and the other ones could go as high as 35%. So that's where we are today. And that is part of the reasons that these companies have decided to leave, because they already know what will happen to their duties, because it was based, the one that they have today is based on 2022, the one they will have next year will be based on 2023, and then hopefully gradually less, because there's nobody left. But value-added manufacturers like us are virtually paying double what we had before, where we only should be paying on first mill. So add to that, then, to put it into perspective, what I'm saying, it was the BC government, BC Liberals, as well as the NDP, even still today, and I look at another minister of forest, with all good luck to them, blah, 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 whatever, and the NDP, the Premier 𝗵𝗵𝘁𝗍𝗶, I think he was only, they have no representation in northern BC. There is no representation of this government, the NPD government, north of Hope. There isn't. I think they have 3 in the Kootenays, and then, with all due respect, with I believe the MLA Stewart on Vancouver Island. But otherwise, they do not have any representation. And so, nor do they appear to be, even during the election cycle, are interested in really talking to anybody in the value-added sector. So what I'm saying to the people in general is that we know with the Trump government coming in that tariffs and duties, Trump said, I heard the other day, he loves tariffs and duties, he said. Tariffs to him is more than love, he said. So it means that we have a reasonable expectation where duties will be at, anti-dumping and tariff will be at. We don't know how much more the Trump government will add to this, but it's not going to be good for us collectively. But the other challenge that I'm having is with the BC government, both BC Liberals, and that includes the New Conservatives and John Rustad and all those other people who really don't seem to have very much interest in value-added manufacturing, which is the key to how do we change this industry, nor does Premier 𝗵𝗶𝘁. I've invited both of them to come on my podcast, and let's have a discussion. Right? Let's have a discussion and see where do we go from here. So what I have done at 84, and after being here for 60 years, started from the ground up, 50 years, employ 400 people, and I look at this industry that has such huge potential that I always looked at it that I thought that it takes genius to screw it up. But they did. And even still today, I had an opportunity to have a discussion with the city. I've talked to First Nations, and everybody is looking at it and say, where do we go from here? But if we keep changing government, and we have, I think in the time that I've been in business, probably 15 or 20 different ministers of forest, we need to have direction. We have to have a strategy of going forward. Where will we be the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now? Do we shut down these companies, or do we sell the logs and ship them elsewhere? The timber belongs to you and me, the people. We must demand that we change strategy, we must also demand that those tenure holders that have decided to leave British Columbia, and with all respect to them, I cannot say that I do not support them, because their shareholders obviously demand them to be responsible. Then let's make sure that the timber they control, because most of them still control most of the timber that we have today, is still controlled by companies that are leaving. Let's get it back to the ground and make it available to those that want to invest. Coming back to duties, what I started with, it's not the bad Americans or this, that, or the other thing. It is something that we have allowed to let happen by creating too much consolidation, stopping appurtency, closing the door really in earnest, although they have a program that this government started, the Value-Added Acceleration Program, saying that how do we make fiber available to those that want to invest in value-added manufacturing, unless there is reasonable expectation of access to fiber. No one is going to invest in value-added manufacturing. Why would they? And as long as this government goes out and say, okay, well, we'll give money, that's not what it does. How do we attract entrepreneurship? How do we attract investments in the primary sector again, the way we look at it now? So if I look at, and with all due respect, I was at a great deal of respect for John Organ. Unfortunately, he passed away the other day, and I feel bad about it because I thought he was a visionary. And the intentions paper that he presented, I think it was in the spring of 2021, I spoke to it. So did First Nations, so did Labor, is that we have to be more careful about preserving old growth. We have to stimulate value-added manufacturing. And then we have to involve First Nations in the forest industry. And I agree with all of that. And so where we are now, though, that to First Nations we already know, and I have great deal of respect for them, there are 206 First Nations in the province of British Columbia. Add to that the British Columbia government. Neither of them really have a coherent strategic plan of going forward. And a lot of times can't even agree between themselves, and so then creates uncertainty, and lack of uncertainty scares away capital and entrepreneurship. They have to get together and saying, let's look forward next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Right now we're starting to negotiate another set of softwood lumber again. Let's make sure that value-added manufacturers that do not have timber, that are not subsidized, are paying duty on inputs, not on output, because that will stop further manufacturing. And if we do not do that, and especially not, with all due respect to our friends down on the other side of the border, down south, that the future of British Columbia that is so bountiful, blessed with all the resources, that further manufacturing, which is the key, we have to add more social and economic value to our resources, applies not only to lumber, it applies to all resources. Otherwise, we may as well put them in carloads, ship them elsewhere. And if we don't stand up for what we believe in, or just give it to some organization to negotiate for us, like the Council of Forestry and Industry, was basically controlled by the biggest dues payers and has not been a service to the industry, period, not even to the primaries, in my mind. They may not like these comments, but that's how I feel about it. And so the government has to stand up, be strong, and saying, what's the strategy going forward? Well, the strategy going forward, as far as I'm concerned, take a strong position with the United States. Make sure we understand what they want and how do we go about it. Let's not ship lumber below cost into that market. But the other part is that for further manufacturing, how do we add more value to our resources? I say to the primaries, don't look all over the world to ship your lumber to. Open your front door and look outside and saying, here is the opportunity, right here in British Columbia. And make it a demand. Let's make sure that government makes fiber available to those that have made the commitment to invest here in British Columbia. And not make it a liability, because for sure that we now have to look forward to saying, where do we go from here? What will it look like the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now? Because even First Nations that will get up to, and I support that, 20% of the AAC, BC timber supply is another 2, 3, 4, 5 million cubic meters, that even they will not find any sawmills to produce their lumber and timber. So they won't have it. And all my friends down south there that are sitting there and thinking, oh, well, we're doing fine. Well, I suggest to you 75% of the GDP of this province is generated north of Hope. In the schools that you have and the schools that you want to get and all the infrastructure that you need, there simply will be no money available unless we sink even further into the hole. That's where we are today. Do I believe that is the future? Absolutely. Talking back to softwood lumber, that was the topic of this particular discussion. We have to understand it first, take a stronger position, a reasonable position, of saying further manufacturing we do not want to discourage, we have to encourage. Let's not penalize further manufacturing. And then for the primary manufacturing, the mills will be smaller, they will employ less people, but what I see as a model is innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. That's the model, where 50% of the lumber being manufactured goes up the value chain, stimulate, attract capital and investment. The way I see it right now, where we are going for the next 50, 60 years from now, until the next, this province is amazing how it grows fiber and timber. It's still amazingly high quality, located in the best location in the world, and it has huge opportunity, but it will take probably 20, 30, 40 years from now unless we start now changing direction, until we will attract capital. And in order to attract capital, it starts with entrepreneurship. Crazy guys like me that lay awake all night and saying, I wonder what would happen if I glued things together, did this, that, or the other things. They will find a way. But there has to be hope. And there has to be a story of opportunity. We still have it all here, but we cannot do it if we don't change direction. But what the Americans doing right now, they're not doing it to us. We did it ourselves. In terms of the value-added sector, it is our government, the large associations, the larger companies that look all over the world for markets where they open their front door. Your market is right here. But there has to be reasonable expectations of access to fiber. Without that, you can't. You cannot deny that reasonable expectation of access to fiber if you dump all of your products that could be further manufactured here into China or someplace else in the world. So the timber belongs to us collectively, the people in this province. Stand up, speak out, And I still believe even today, I'm still pursuing to grow our company, still looking at the opportunity to purchase some of the mills that other people don't believe in. And I'm not leaving. I still believe in the industry, but I felt I had to do this podcast because it has been on my mind, and it is time for somebody to speak out about it. Thank you for listening.